what we're going to go over tonight. If you've ever been in any of my trainings before, you hear the same thing every time. Here's your agenda. We'll talk about this, our objectives, what we're going to go over. You should probably already know what's on here. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't have signed up in the first place for a Monday night, right? There's a lot more entertaining things out there in the world than me, but hopefully this is a good competitor. I say that all to you so that you can just kind of sit back, relax. These are being recorded, so you can always come back to it. PDF version will be available for you in the notes. So again, I think the best way to kind of listen is to just do that, is to just listen. But of all those things we're going to go over tonight, we're going to talk about AFN kits and how to use them. Um, Talking specifically through the lens of, usually it's IDD or intellectual and developmental disability. But tonight we're going to be including and more specifically talking about neurodiverse populations. We'll get into Philadelphia's legacy of being disability friendly, which I think is really, really awesome, especially as we come into the 250th anniversary birthday, whatever we're calling it. There's a lot of really Philadelphia-centric stuff that I'm really excited about, and I don't even live there. So it really, really cool stuff that you guys are going to be exposed to, have access to use the word there, ability to talk about how to engage with people in the neurodiverse community. My biggest takeaway for all of you is to realize that this isn't, brain surgery. A lot of this comes back to talk to other people how you'd want to be spoken to. A lot of it is trying to see past what might be right in front of you. So it's a little bit of detective work sometimes when it talks about communicating with people, but there is no if X happens, do Y and Z. Sometimes people find that frustrating. Sometimes people find that interesting. Nonetheless, that's kind of how it is. So with that, let me give you a little bit of background as to who's talking to you tonight. Again, that's my title at Perform Care. We are a managed care behavioral health organization. That means at the end of the day, we authorize and provide care management for people with Medicaid and Medicare. I am at the very end of the spectrum of doing actual work in the field, which is why I'm here talking to you tonight, part of our initiative to just make communities safer. I myself am on the county board of mental health and wellness. It's essentially the board of mental health. We just renamed it in our county. So I'm sure something will be coming to I think actually you guys renamed a bunch of offices recently. So what's going around, right? I'm also a board member, more importantly, for this kind of discussion for the National Association on the Dually Diagnosed, for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, as well as mental illness or mental health concerns. Actually, doesn't have to be an actual diagnosis, because as we're learning, a lot of folks don't necessarily have a diagnostic issue. It's more of a communication or a needs issue. And I'm also a leader committee member in Monmouth County in New Jersey, hence me not living in Philadelphia. And those of you that don't know, this started off as like a very basic grassroots conversation between me and the coordinator at Monmouth. I reached out to a bunch of different places, and Satori and Sonia were some of the only ones that raised their hands and said, yeah, we would like some of this. Reached out to the coordinators to make sure that I wasn't some crazy person that was just talking about stuff that was nonsense, and here we are. So kudos to your MRC unit for looking out to go beyond what's actually out there, what's required, things like that. The majority of what I talk about is from my experiences, both working in the field as well as my own personal experiences with neurodiverse family members. Full disclosure, nobody has a diagnosis or anything like that, but I lean on some giftedness, and I lean on some traumatic, well, it's not some, that's the diagnosis, traumatic brain injury with another family member. So that's my lived experience. That's what really drives a lot of where this comes from and how I approach the things and how we talk about them here. I'm also a husband, a dad. I have a dog who's scratching at my office door right now because he's separated from me, so he's having a traumatic experience. So that's your fault. And just like to do a lot of these things. I like to talk to people that are doing the real work and getting their, hands dirty, so to speak. I have this always in here. I changed the wording of it, but just to kind of put it out there, anytime I talk about certain topics, it's unavoidable. I may not include one of the diagnoses that might fall under an umbrella, and I'll explain what that looks like as soon as we get there. Autism spectrum disorder has become very political, which is sad. But on the other side of it, it's also a good thing that there's attention. So again, equally divided issues there. So my goal is to give you the information and make it very difficult for you to figure out who I like to vote for. Just giving you information where it is, where it comes from. You will see citations on every slide. May not be in the best citation form. APA is my game, but hopefully it's at least there's links there so you can see where this stuff comes from. The other stuff, like I said, working in crisis intervention. I used to do civil commitments on people in New Jersey. So very intense stuff, working in emergency rooms, inpatient units, things like that, institutions. So anytime I give a specific example, it is from real world stuff. I've changed the details of it, for HIPAA and for someone's respect and privacy. So all of that to kind of jump in and really just get started in the AFN kit world. And let's talk about what is neurodiversity. You could fill a room with 100 people and ask them what neurodiversity means, and you're going to get 100 different answers. So I did my best to find definitions that I have been including for a while in my trainings. Not necessarily because I agree with them, but because of where they come from. The biggest here is the Cleveland Clinic, which I lean on for a lot of things, as well as the National Institutes of Health and how they're defining things. So I rarely read, but I'm going to do a little bit of that right now. So being neurodivergent rather, means having a brain that works differently from the average or neurotypical person. That simple. It's important for me to also preclude this with saying neurodiversity is not a diagnosis. It's like I was saying earlier, it's a category, it's a classification, it's something that a diagnosis falls under, but is not itself an actual diagnosis. It's more of a medical term and it's a social construct that we came up with as a society as opposed to diagnostic criteria. Excuse me. This could be differences in social preferences, how you learn, communicating, and other ways of perceiving the environment. So this isn't anything new. These are things we've known in education for decades, right? We've approached this. This is why we have teachers major in education as opposed to being subject matter experts. We've kind of flipped the way we approach children and how they're educated. But we didn't really do that with this population until recently, where we're actually identifying folks and people are coming forward proudly, saying, I have X, Y, and Z. Whatever your opinion is about the neurodiversity, movement, because there is that side of things where there's political pressures and things of that nature, where people are coming forward and are very proud and outgoing with their description of themselves or their diagnosis. That's something that we have not seen because stigma was always pounding people into the ground with that stuff. So that is nice to see out there, people being strong advocates for themselves. But there's also on the other side of it, just like any other discussion that touches politics, you have people that are arguing about people that have profound autism or people that are the highest level needs. People with autism arguing now you're putting everybody in the same category with these people, where you have people that are, chief executive officers with the same diagnosis. And they're not completely wrong about the diagnostic classification, but this is how quickly things can go into one direction or the other. So having said that, it's the idea that people are going to have a positive experience for everybody when it's neuro-inclusive. And that's what we're really going for, is that definition of what neuro-inclusivity is. Regardless of your thinking style, it's going to be a positive experience. And a place that tries to do that really well, if you're trying to think, and you don't have to have been there to imagine it, it's a place like Disney World. Disney World is going to try to appeal to everybody's senses the best that they can. You're going to have, dark rides and outside rides, things that have smells when you walk in line, things with bright lights or no lights at all. That's appealing to sensory diversity and sensory needs and wants. And your task as an MRC volunteer or, someone that's involved in the Office of Emergency Management, OEM stuff, you have to be inclusive of everybody. And I'm going to show you some statistics, hopefully they're in this slideshow, that show how many people we're actually talking about, especially in a city large like Philadelphia. But that's our actual definitions, and that's what we're going to show. These are, generally speaking, what is accepted to be neurodiversity. And I like this infographic. It is not mine. This belongs to Johns Hopkins, so I stole it right off of their website. But here's their link right here. But at the center, you have this neurodiversity, entity, and on the outer, just right outside of it, I should say, you have these positive traits, which I really like because on the outside, we have pathology or diagnoses, right? So a lot of people, previously were, not happy, rightfully so, being defined by a diagnosis or a label. Here, people are coming together under the label, under the branding, whatever, of neurodiversity. And we're focusing on the abilities or the special skills that people with certain diagnoses seem to have. And that is pretty interesting stuff to see. So you'll see it's almost like any other matrix when it comes to, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, like almost like a SWOT analysis of a business. And you could see how closely related some of these things are. I don't expect you to know everything here. I'm going to just briefly go over it. So on the left side here, we have autism spectrum condition. It's interesting that it calls it condition and not disorder. So that's an interesting thing right here. And then we have right next to it on both sides, we have mental health, and on the other side, we have dyspraxia, which is an issue with physically knowing your muscle abilities, coordination issues, things like that. But right under it, we have all these different things here: sensory awareness, empathy, intuition, and you wonder like where do those things come from, and how does dyspraxia have anything to do with that? But there are studies that show having one need here develops a positive outcome elsewhere. So it's almost like compensation, and you'll see one thing affect another. And this is, again, one of the first times, almost like in medicine in general, where we're seeing positive take on pathology. And that's just a really cool thing to see. And then on the opposite side of the spectrum, so to speak, you have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, as you've probably heard it. Creativity, energy, passion, things like that. And then directly next to that, you've got Tourette's syndrome, which is what's called a tic disorder. Someone that might verbally say things or do things that they're just not capable of controlling or even being conscious that it's happening until it's over. So there's things like that. And then dyslexia, dyscalculia are when we're transposing numbers or letters when we're trying to read or do math. A lot of times people don't realize that they have these things until they're far into elementary or even further in school. In fact, I was talking at one of these types of trainings a while ago with a former coworker of mine who was attending just to be supportive, and I started talking about those top three things about learning disorders and her 19-year-old daughter who had been struggling with just college English. Everything else she was doing great in, but college English she could not pass. And there was an issue with, I think, high school kind of just pushing her through and, kicking the can down the road. And when she got to college, where, I guess the buck literally stops there, there was an issue. And the issue was that she had dyslexia. She was transposing letters. And nobody figured it out until the mom was like, oh my God, that sounds like my daughter. And testing showed that she absolutely had it. Kind of a disservice to finally find that out. This was someone that went to public schools in a arguably nice suburban area in New Jersey, kind of like what you would picture people that want to move out to the suburbs to a public school on purpose would go to, hoping that that would be the type of district that you would get that diagnosis in pre-K and not after you're done. But these are things that people don't talk about. There's no, I mean, I'm a, quote unquote expert, and I never took a course in any of these things because they don't exist. Just now, I shouldn't say that about mental health. Obviously, there's stuff there, and I'm a licensed therapist. I took classes there, but there's not a major in autism spectrum disorder. You can't find that stuff. You might find some lectures on these things up here if you take some learning or education classes, but they're not a strong focus anywhere. Not in medical school, nursing. And I'm on some of these committees where we're trying our best to let the people know, like, hey, we need a basically like the Medical Reserve Corps. We need a cadre of a whole group of people that are ready to step up and do what's needed. So to be continued. And this slide is sort of like the back end of my warning. I'm going to forget things. I'm not going to include everything. We could go on and on and on forever. And I'm going to show you a chart where it starts to list out not just mental health, but which mental health disorders. And you're just like, why not just say all of them at this point? And the issue is that it's a group of people with something in common, and there's nothing to say you can't belong or you can't belong. It's do we have something in common? And at the end of the day, everyone's going to have something in common. So the group does continue to get bigger. Now, I think for purposes like this, that's great because I'm just now teaching to, the other people that may not have gotten the good training from the regular stuff that you're supposed to get. This is in addition to that. And it only just speaks to the legacy of Philadelphia because there really is a connection there with accessibility and things like that. So things like misophonia. There's people out there. I couldn't tell you the specific statistic, but it's a small percentage, but it's a full percentage at least of people that have the ability to hear things that make them really angry or irritated. I'm not going to say I'm one of these people, but I can hear things, tiny little things where I can hear like a watch ticking 3 rooms away, things like that. Doesn't make me angry or anything, but there are people that it makes it the central focus of their attention. They cannot focus on anything else other than that. Right now, as you're listening to me, hearing my voice, I am sure wherever you are, there are other sounds that your brain is hopefully doing its best to ignore. Depending on where you are on this whole plane of existence and spectrum of abilities, you could or could not tune out X amount of percentage of all of that. We talked about tic disorders and Tourette's already. Processing speed, if you've ever talked to somebody from a different country or even a different part of our country, there's a very big difference. Or if you've been to another part of the United States, we all live on the side of, one side of or the other of the Delaware River. Philly people, Jersey people, New York people, we move a certain speed and it's on the above average side of things, right? We have a certain attitude and finesse to us. It's faster than a lot of other areas. Is that teaching to the norm? Is that teaching to what's around us? Or is somebody having an issue and they're outside of those norms? When we talk about processing speed or how quickly somebody can respond to something, somebody takes a standardized test, gets an IQ score, and processing speed is one of those subdivided actual subtests. And it'll give you a number, and that contributes to your average full scale IQ score, the number that you tell a person. And a lot of times that can get biasly dragged up or down based on even where you're from, the culture that you grow up in. So a lot of these things aren't always standardized. So you got to kind of think of that stuff. And I'm saying this is the first connection between where we're starting today and where we're going to end next week when we talk about all the really cool things that you have going on in your city throughout the rest of the year, where you're going to have people from outside of Philadelphia, New York, and New Jersey. You're going to have people from other continents coming here because of the level of attractive stuff you have. So you need to keep that in mind behind not only is this person processing this faster or slower, but are they understanding what I'm speaking, not only because of their ability cognitively, but just language in and of itself. Are they understanding English? Is it American English that they're listening to? British people obviously speak English, but it's not exactly the same thing. Same thing with Jamaica, in some other areas, there's niches to these things. And when you're trying to figure something out with somebody related to healthcare, that's where you got to dig in for those details. Another way to look at this for my, left brain versus right brain people, meaning how you yourselves perceive the world, because I have to not only talk about it, but I have to provide the two sides to this coin of how we're learning about this. So not only am I giving you the verbiage, but I'm showing you how this actually looks. So if you've never seen this before, this is called a bell curve because it looks like a bell. It has that shape. What this is showing you what's called a normal distribution. So if I took 1,000 randomized people, truly randomized people, I use a randomizer that looks at social security numbers and it randomly picks people. 1,000 people, 1,000,000 people, the number doesn't matter. The higher, the better. But what it will show is that when you show a true random sample, this is the distribution of people's intellect or their IQ, among other, things that are scaled on a normal scale. And that's what you are getting to when you talk about a standardized test or a standardized score. That none of that's the important part. That's just the context of the background. When we talk about education, curriculum, training, all that stuff that is published by journals and published by, Office of Emergency Management, government, everything that's in textbooks. That's covering everything from this left side all the way to here, in between these two brackets that are pointing out and away. And what that is, these little SDs, this negative 1.0, -2, -3, those are called standard deviations. And this is getting into statistics and stuff about math that I don't like and we don't need to talk about. But what that really means is it's showing you what's called the distribution, how many groups the farther out you go. So under here, under this sliver right here is about, and don't quote me, it's somewhere between, I want to say it's like 34% the population is going to be on this side, and another 34% of the population is going to be on this side. And this directly right here is the mean or the average. So an IQ test is going to have an average score of 100, meaning that 68% of the entire population, let's say of the United States, is going to be somewhere, 68% of that population is going to be somewhere between 85, which is down here, and 115, which is up here, meaning that these standard deviations are 15 points apart, right? The further out you go, you're noticing that it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. When you're behind this 2.0, below it or above it, that is what we're talking about mathematically when we're talking about neurodiverse. That is the remaining about 2% of the population that's not getting included in this specific bill, right? So these are called the tails. So right now, what I'm talking about, I'm talking to the tails. Because you know what? At the end of the day, it's a small sliver of the population. But when you do the math, and I'm going to do the math with you right here. Here's my iPhone. I see that my daughter has changed it to a scientific calculator. Good for her. I don't know what I'm doing. Like I said, we have some people in my family that are on one side of this and the other. So we're going to multiply our population, 330 million times 0.02, and that gets 6.6 million people. So right now we're trying to talk about the population of 6.6 million people, if we're talking about just those ends of the tails. But when we're talking about neurodiversity, we tend to include more than just those outer tails. We include the inner part too, which is good for another 6% or so on each side of those tails. So now we're talking about a percentage that gets us closer to about 30 to 40 million people. Sorry, I'm having an issue plugging in. There we go. Um, that's talking about a much larger chunk of our population. And again, when you're talking about large events, big things happening, disasters, and you live in a city and you've got 1,000,000 people, 20% of 1,000,000 people is still 200,000 people. That's a lot of people that may not be getting your warnings, your directions, access to functional needs, all of that stuff aren't going to be getting it because it's not the way that we, as the experts, have been taught to provide it because this is very new, right? We're only realizing, oh, we forgot. We were only thinking about this is the special needs population. I don't know if you could see it, but I have the pointer all the way to the left below the -3.0. That's where really, the moderate to severe people with IDD, intellectual developmental disabilities, that's where that percentage of the population is. About 1 or 2% is just below here in this area. When I talk about neurodiversity, intellectually speaking. I'm talking about people with intellectual disability, but I'm also talking about that same very small sliver of population on the right side or the positive side, meaning above zero and not below it. So if I'm talking about somebody that's three standard deviations or four standard deviations above the mean, that means they're getting like 160 on their IQ. And there's only about less than 1% of the population that has that. There's an equal amount on both sides according to nature and the bell curve. And that's just how nature is distributed. And that is literally how it goes, which is very interesting. And that's a whole other conversation. But when we talk about neurodiversity, we're talking about people with developmental disabilities, but we're also talking about people that do not have developmental disabilities that are extremely gifted. But they're in this category because they might think and approach things differently. They might need different instruction. So here's a little bit more detailed with some statistics from people that do the research more than I do, which is I don't do any. So this is very helpful. So here we have on the left side specific types of disorders and examples of their diagnoses. So dyslexia, dyspraxia, dysgraphia. Dysgraphia is the same thing like I was talking about before, but with like words and sentences, things of that nature. Then we have what's also included under that mental health aspect. And mental health is a slippery slope, so to speak. And I say that because each of these disorders are very large potential segments of the population. Anxiety disorders are the most commonly provided diagnosis out of all that are out there. Depression is up there as well. So when you're including these major chunks that are coming out of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, you may have heard of the DSM. It's on the fifth edition now. Um, this is a lot of people, tens of millions of people. So it's good that we're identifying people that have a different method of learning and understanding and communicating, but I want you to understand the scale of who we're talking about. You'll also notice these giant ranges when it comes to statistics and data on this population because the research really isn't that great sometimes. So we have to take the bottom and the high end of these prevalence ranges. So here you can see for yourself where these ranges are. The generic neurodivergent condition somewhere between 17 and 33%. I use 20% because it's an easy number to translate into your population, which I think is 1 million, which is why it's an easy math thing to do. It's not based on anything scientific other than it's in that range. There is no way to collect this information because it's not a diagnosis. And even if it were, we don't collect that information anyway, which is a whole other issue. This is a really cool feature that the city of Philadelphia has. If you have the time and the interest to look around your Philadelphia government website, there are some really cool things. When I was preparing for this, I was looking up, unique aspects of Philadelphia, which we'll get into next week. Some really cool, interesting stuff. You got some interesting heat pockets because of the way your stuff is shaped and where elevation is. Some really bizarre stuff that actually contributes to some issues. But this is a heat map. Heat not meaning necessarily the sun, but how frequent of an issue there is in an area. And if you were to be doing this live, you just hover the mouse or the cursor rather over your own neighborhood, and it'll pop up with the percentage population in that neighborhood with an actual disability. So for Sonia, for your planning purposes, AFN kits, all that good stuff, volunteers planning ahead, you can see, and I don't know Philadelphia very well. I feel like CHOP is over here somewhere. Other than that, I don't know very well, and it's probably all the way over here. I don't know. But you can see if you're going to be doing a flu clinic in this area, you might want to pack some accessibility things. If it's going to be somewhere out here, very different, or where there's no residential. These are the tools that you might have on you that you may not realize. This is all accessible through your phones and stuff. Talking about inclusion and that legacy of Philadelphia, I think it's kind of cool that number one, Philadelphia is the city of brotherly love, all that stuff, and it's got that Rocky legacy of the underdog, that kind of stuff. And I think it's really cool that it's participating directly in this thing that I'm going to explain because it really is about that underdog, getting people that may not have access to things what they need. It's very Philly. So there's this initiative by Special Olympics Pennsylvania called the Cities of Inclusion. Cities of Inclusion is an initiative to be just that, a city that makes people, all people, feel and emotionally attached to that place, actually included. Not efforts, but to truly be feeling that inclusion. So a person with a disability feels and says they are included. That's their measure of success. It's not like increase amount of bus stops that are accessible by X%. It's just that subjective response, talking to people with disabilities and hearing that they feel that they're included in their city's planning. So there's nothing worse than that. I get the New York channels by me, and after we had that huge ice storm, I think you guys got it pretty bad too, where we were buried with snow for, I mean, I think there was still snow on the ground yesterday, and it was like 70 something degrees. Um, but looking around even my, neighborhood, thinking about anyone that uses a wheelchair, couldn't even get off of a curb because the snow had been packed so high from plows. I was seeing videos of Philadelphia, the narrow streets, and people have nowhere to put the snow. Can't imagine how difficult it would have been to get around a city in a situation like that. And, Department of Sanitation's first thought isn't going to be about that. It's finish the job, get the snow away. They're not necessarily thinking that way, and it's probably not something that they're trained to. So that's something we can try to sell to them at some point too. Um, Talking about if caregiver or family members feels like that person is included. A lot of times people with disabilities have a very low threshold. I've noticed in my own observations, this is just me, not anybody's research, but my own experience is just working in the field. And then I worked in the quality department taking complaints for 3 years. And one of the, bigger observations I had was that people with the most severe needs complained the absolute least. People with the least needs complained the most. It was like this reverse, correlation that was really interesting to see. So I say that because talking about a caregiver, a family member who thinks that their person they're caring for is included is a different measure than that person with the disability feeling like they're included because they might think because one thing was done that they're now being included. It's a low bar because it always has been, unfortunately. Businesses and organizations, employment are inclusive, explicitly looking out to include people with disabilities. I am working with this group on what's called the employment track, and we're inviting Philadelphia businesses to come, those that have people that are inclusive, those inclusive businesses of people with disabilities and everything else for that matter, are being invited to come and talk, share and network, get put on display, all that stuff. And those that are interested are being invited to learn how they can do things like that as well. The other thing that I think your mayor did a couple of years ago was partner with this organization called Culture City, which is a sensory friendly organization. They started out actually working with military veterans with PTSD, moving into adults with dementia, Parkinson's, stroke patients, and moving into the sensory issues with people with neurodiversity and autism. So seeing Philadelphia spending money on that kind of stuff and getting involved is something that you don't always see other large cities doing. So it really is something nice to see. It's not being done everywhere. And it very much is collaborative. And it's progressive, which is a really cool thing that, no matter where you're at on the spectrum of politics, life, and anything, you can get behind that. I wanted to show you some employee information. And I bring this in because it's really hard to find research and data about people that are neurodivergent. One, because as you've seen, that can mean a lot of different things. And two, this is more of like a controlled environment where expectations are 9 to 5 or whatever your employment is. I'm making assumptions that these are all office jobs. But nonetheless, for the most part, I think we could agree that when we're talking about people that are employed full time, no matter what the job is, there's an expectation of normalcy, right? I work X and X hours. And yes, of course, there are jobs where that doesn't happen, right? Right now, I'm talking to you at 6:36. I'm, 2.5 hours past my normal day. I start the day much earlier, but either way, we're just making that agreement that this is the general thing that we're talking about. So Of this group of people that identified themselves as being neurodiverse, only 21% felt comfortable or needing to disclose it to HR, 39 to their manager, and to their team, 24%. Now, these are numbers. They can mean a lot of things. I immediately think of, if I have or had a disability, who would I feel comfortable disclosing it to? I think these numbers make sense to some degree if we're talking about somebody that's looking for assistance or an understanding, versus letting people know why I might be a certain way, right? With HR, it's probably I needed to let them know, which might be the case, for some people. If they're coming to you as a volunteer, hey, I need X, Y, or Z, that means that there's, if we're trying to draw some parallels here, that means that there's a real need there, and there's an issue. We see that, among their peers, they're only telling 1 in 4. So, we'll say that's the minority, so to speak. We know that we might need to offer help before somebody's asking for it, right? So those are the two, you know, ideas that I've kind of put onto here as a spectrum of forethought. You can't really get into somebody's mind and make assumptions, but um, a lot of this tells us some insight about what the population might be comfortable with under non-disaster conditions, which is kind of what we're talking about right now, right? Expected large gatherings, preventive preparedness events, clinics, things like that. And then employees in general with a condition, a disability classification, who are we talking about and what does it look like? So a visible disability would be somebody that is using some type of device or has some type of accommodation that's very obvious to the eye. Somebody that's using a wheelchair, physically, has to use something like that. Sometimes visible could mean like a walker, some type of augmented communication device like an iPad, something like that. And then 62%, it's invisible unless disclosed. And I'm sorry, let me come back to visible. It could even be something like Down syndrome, where their physical features look different. You can see somebody and say, okay, their facial structure is physically different. There's something genetically is going on with that person, right? And that's a real thing in some genetic disorders like Down syndrome. Autism is not visible, so that's where neurodiversity and all these other things come in. The other thing I want to put out there, because again, neurodiversity means how we think and how we understand language and how we learn things. I want to put this into your heads as well. Invisible unless disclosed can mean somebody that's in distress. And that can be somebody that's in distress because of a mental health issue, like we saw that's here. And one thing that I don't see typically in the neurodiversity is chronic pain. Um, I will tell you, I am somebody that suffers from chronic pain. If you could see me in person, you would see I have 3 very large scars, 2 on the front of my throat and up my neck, and 1 on the back. I've had 4 neck surgeries and some major, major issues, losing sensation in my left hand. I'm not saying that to do the whole, being upset or anything like that and getting that. I'm saying it because you wouldn't know that, I hope, sitting here listening to me, that as I'm talking to you, it feels like somebody's stabbing me in the back, right? I can keep that controlled until I can't, right? There might be a time at some point, once we get around 7 o'clock, I'm not going to be able to sit anymore. Sitting is the most uncomfortable position for me, right? So I'm bringing that up as an example because I have to keep it together for a specific amount of time. Now, if I'm in a stadium and I didn't know I was going to have a bad day, and I don't have medication on me anymore, or aspirin, whatever we're talking about for whatever the issue is, that's going to be an issue. Throw in irritating people around me, throw in all sorts of variables that can make a person even more irritable, or even worse, somebody is on pain medication and they start drinking on top of it. It's just another thought for you to have in your brain as you're talking to somebody. Whether it's a visible disability and they're using stuff where you could see there's a physical issue there, or it's not, and it's somebody that you would never guess in a million years there's something going on. You really never know unless somebody is outwardly telling you for a specific reason, which I myself have done because, you know, there's times where I need to just stand up in a meeting and I didn't want people to be like, why is this person just randomly standing up? Just wanted to let my boss know, like, hey, if you have me in a 2-hour meeting, that's great. Around 60 minutes, I'm gonna have to stand up because my entire hand is completely worthless at that point. Um, That's my comfort level. Most people aren't going to go there, hence the under 40% disclosure. Unless it's absolutely necessity, a lot of people aren't going to ask or tell you. So that's the parallel with that group. A little bit more information about that, how people felt in the workplace. I'm actually surprised these numbers aren't higher, but again, same group looking at the disability experience, discomfort, avoidance, insults directly, and misjudgment. Misjudgment is probably the most subjective. How did a person perceive me? It's interesting how your own bias about what other people might be thinking of you, your own anxiety, that you might be putting on other people is really, really powerful. So this might also be going on again in somebody's head that has a visible disability or somebody that doesn't, that you're not going to be able to account for. So really what you have to rely on is this, right? So if you're in a city of 1 million people that's getting an extra few 100,000 because of all these events that are coming, or there's a disaster and everybody's going to the same place, this is a big chunk of that. Again, you saw the stats around 20% again for that easy number. Neuroinclusivity workplace is, again, that parallel for things that you could do in environments that you're expecting people to be in. So stadiums, shelters, clinics, things of that nature. You can take this and kind of make a parallel to it. We may have seen some of this stuff before when I talked about this stuff in the past, but it's important and it's relevant. Redesigning hiring practices, selecting for talent. This is a parallel to the volunteer base that you have in front of you and who may or may not work well together or what task. Same thing for the people you might be assisting. You might have somebody that comes in that can't wait in the line for some reason, and you may have somebody that's in charge of that line that is very focused on following the rules, and that's a bad match, and that's happened. We had that issue happen in Monmouth, which is why the stuff is here. We had a volunteer who was possibly having some issues on the mental health side that was butting heads with a employee of the county, and that became a much bigger issue. But some practical things that you can have. Obviously, these things cost money, so I have some cheaper alternatives on the back end. But noise canceling headphones, and again, just because we're talking about MRC volunteerism doesn't mean this doesn't apply to your own life or people that you know. Statistically, some of you on this call can use this for real life. Actually, statistically on this call, 4 or 5 of you can use this information. See that number in the math stuff again? So, noise canceling headphones, desk placement of choice. Let's think about that in the real world. Is there some reason why a person wants to be in a certain area, and is it a big deal if they're standing in a certain place versus another? Traffic patterns around workspaces, or traffic patterns around, or if you're doing shelter placement around where cots are going, or where you're going to have the actual injection for a flu clinic. Be mindful of things like harsh lighting. Have rear view mirrors. I know I don't like to have somebody standing behind me while I'm doing something. I worked in a giant call center once, and they used a stoplight, like a traffic signal thing, to let people know in larger areas whether or not you're available. So if you're in like a clinic or a stadium and you're available to help people, red, yellow, green, you got the green light up, things like that. Talking to one another, recording, meeting, and having different types of things out there. This is an ideal space. This brings me more into the AFN kit specifically. What do we have practically for people that have access and functional need kit issues? What do you have available for them? This is ideal stuff. And this isn't, most people see this and they think of, autism spectrum disorder right off the bat. But I want you to think about your own life and people in it and the kind of environment you would describe if you described a place that you can go to calm down, right? I know on a day like this, I woke up today and immediately knew it was going to be a good day to, sit with a cup of coffee and just relaxingly go over my trainings. It was going to be calm because of the weather, the darkness, all that stuff. Whereas yesterday it was bright out. I was outside all day. I actually did manual labor, which I can't stand doing, because you're fueled by the sun. We're really, really susceptible to our environment and where things come from as far as our emotions and in that respect. So somebody that has hypersensitivity needs, and we can go over each of these diagnoses for an hour each as to why those sensitivities are there, either hyper or hypo, meaning above or below what we would consider to be the normal or typical amount of stimulation that somebody needs. And for you, that could be, if you've ever worn a piece of clothing and like the tag's really annoying, imagine that, but there's no tag, things like that where there's something tactile that's bothering you. We develop these spaces where people can come in and relax because not only is it darker, we're getting rid of those, ultraviolet lights from the fluorescent lights rather. Um, but there's things to touch. You can't really see it well from this picture, but this hanging curtain are actual like individual strands of beads, so somebody can physically like manipulate and touch them. Having little fidgets, all those things that, I have a 9-year-old and a 12-year-old that like even when they were a little younger, they like to play with. All those things are great for keeping somebody occupied, while they're doing things, having ice packs because it can change somebody's sensing from not just because it's hot out, but it is in and of itself a strong and powerful stimulant. Putting somebody's hands in ice water like is a strong stimulant to make them um, potentially snap out of something because it is affecting your brain and how is interpreting the environment around it. Cheap alternative, by the way, for loud noises, earplugs. You can get a huge thing of these from like a Sam's or a Costco or something like that for really cheap, and they're disposable. So you can just give them to people, and they're really not that annoying to have in your ears. But again, to each their own. This is another slide you've probably seen if you've been in here before with me, about hidden disabilities. If you ever see somebody with a sunflower necklace or anything like that, this is and this is an international initiative that's being marketed in the States now. Definitely something at Philadelphia Airport definitely has this. But it's a way of signaling to people, I might need another minute. I might need a further explanation. I'm not trying to be disrespectful. I really am that concrete. You can imagine when you're interacting with law enforcement, somebody that may have autism or neurodiversity where they're not communicating like the, quote unquote, typical population could come off as having an attitude or being disrespectful. So with that in mind, things like this are a good way to let people that are trying to help you know that you might need something, additional. This is a good way of understanding different methods, like I was saying before, of how to receive and interact with information, right? So if we're talking about, again, Office of Emergency Management, preparedness, plans, and all that stuff, the messaging needs to be a certain way for this population, the formatting, delivery, and pace. It all has to be thought through a different lens. The good news is that you don't necessarily have to change it for the general population because they'll probably still do very well with it anyway. But you have to keep in mind that people, again, are thinking and learning and interacting with that information differently. So when we're talking about neurodiverse, not IDD specifically, talking about the neurodiverse in general, clear, concise, consistent messaging, concrete, short phrases, avoid jargon, avoid sarcasm, avoid metaphors, anything that's what did my kid call it from fourth grade English? Figurative language. Don't use figurative language because you're talking about things that won't necessarily translate. Again, like I said before, dealing with people from another country, even if they speak English and the words don't line up correctly, there's going to be a miscommunication. Or if it is English to some other language and it's not the same, you're going to lose something in that translation. That phrase lost in translation exists for a reason. So if we start using, we call them colloquialisms, the city of brotherly love, somebody from outside of this area is not going to have an idea as to what that means. If you translated that into French, they're not going to get it because it doesn't make sense. Formatting, simple, logical, avoiding long text and paragraphs, delivery using multiple formats. That's where it's really important. And you guys do, your MRC does a good job getting information out in multiple delivery methods. That's really helpful. You do, use big visuals and data points, which is much better than, paragraphs of information. Pace, using pauses, asking questions and to ensure understanding. I myself am noticing I am picking up the pace because it's 6:50 and I have a few more important slides to go through. But I'm remembering that we'll also have some more time with this. Hypersensitivity and sensory processing. I wanted to show you both sides of where things are. You might have somebody with the same exact diagnosis have complete 180-degree differences in how they like and perceive the world. On the left side, you have somebody that says, I love movement. Somebody might not stop they may not want to stop moving. This could be somebody that likes to twirl to calm themselves down, or it could be somebody that enjoys running because it helps them calm down. It doesn't have to be pathology. On the opposite side, you may have somebody that doesn't like to brush their teeth, not because they're oppositional, but because those bristles to them don't feel like bristles to you. Don't like bright lights. Neither do I. I don't have a diagnosis, but I don't like those bright lights either. Those are some basic things. Sensory sensitivity, it has been told to me, and I kind of get it too. I'll give you an example. My daughter, my 9-year-old, is in competitive cheerleading. Again, I'm not somebody with a diagnosis. However, I am very sensitive when I walk into one of the competitions. If you've ever been around competitive cheering, it's extremely loud. Yeah, we're getting some thumbs ups here. It's very loud. The bass it's thumping, but it's like thumping and causing nausea. It's so loud. It's a lot. And I noticed that I immediately get irritable. Like my 12-year-old is like, do you want to stand outside? I'll let you know to when it's over, you can come in. Like it's a thing for me. And that's okay. I can understand that. I can process that. I'm a licensed therapist that is aware that I am sensitive to this environment. I could be smart and just put my headphones on, right? So it's noticing that. And in that experience, I'd like to metaphorically use and say, which I shouldn't, but it's a really good metaphor, so I'm going to say it anyway. It's like you're listening to the radio or even my voice right now, right? You can change the volume on your speaker, but it's not off until you go to, until you shut the laptop or whatever it is you're on right now. It's like a radio that never stops or a TV that never shuts off. The volume can go all the way down to 1, but it can never go to 0. There is no 0. It's always on. There's no mute button. So is the teeth bristles at a 9 where I'm not gonna brush my teeth for the next 6 months? Or, which way is the severity going? Somebody that likes running and jumping versus somebody that's swinging and sliding. Somebody that doesn't like to bathe, again, not because they're being oppositional, but because the water may actually physically hurt their skin to some degree. So those are things you got to think about when you're outside with people, or they're saying it's cold, it's hot. It may be way more intense than we normally would think, because we don't think that way. Turning up the temperature a little bit, and then I think we'll cut it and see if there's any questions, because this is a good place to kind of halt it, and I don't want to hijack somebody's evening. See what I did there? So this is something called amygdala hijack, and it's a pretty well-known phenomenon around issues with danger. When we're talking about somebody that is truly scared, this is what happens to our brains when we're scared of something, when our fight or flight mechanism is turned on. And this is all a lot of jargon in here, a lot of information, but at the end of the day, looking over here at the brains, our higher cortex is where we think about consequences, benefits. It's the Monday morning quarterback. If I was in that active shooter situation, I wouldn't have gone through the window. I would have crawled under the desk. You have the ability, that benefit of hindsight and going back and looking at something, because you have the ability to use your cortex. But I guarantee if somebody kicked your door in right now and was holding a gun to your head, you can't think anymore, because what's happening, we have a name for what's happening, that fight or flight. It's called amygdala hijack. Part of your brain that's responsible for that fight or flight mechanism, it's called the amygdala. And what happens, it literally stops the messages from going into the higher cortex, and it handles them right here. It just makes you act. When somebody says, I don't know how I got that car off of that baby, I just acted. I wasn't thinking. That's what they're talking about. That's the name for what that actual mechanism is. That's where people's, superhuman strength comes from. Or, you see these horrible videos where there is an active shooter or something, and you see people just reacting. There's no thinking, there's just reacting. That's what this is. So if we're in a disaster situation, all the things we were just talking about, all the planning, all of that practicing, gone. That's why you drill. That's why you do things over and over again. Because muscle memory is a real thing, and so is amygdala hijack. You have a disproportionate reaction to certain things. This is what is responsible for making you have road rage because your kidneys and your endocrine system is being brought into all this because as soon as that amygdala is highlighted, that's where that fight or flight comes from. So your body, your central nervous system is like, if you remember the old Popeye where he would eat the spinach and all of a sudden his arms and his legs got really big to go. That's what's happening. If you've ever gotten nervous and you could feel those butterflies in your stomach, that's literally you feeling the resources leaving your digestive system and they're being redistributed to your fists and to your feet so that you can either fight or flight. So that's all that. I think because we have everybody here, well, hopefully, I'm going to stop there because it's 6:57. Like I said, I didn't want to hijack things. So I'm going to stop there and see if anyone has any questions. There's only like 4 or 5 more slides, so we can start there next week. But does anyone have any questions for me? I can continue if people are good with that. I could be done in about 15 minutes. Sonia, your call.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat.
Okay.
It's kind of up to you. I know the webinar won't automatically close at 7, so if you'd like to
You know what?
continue,
You're recording,
or
so why don't I do it because
okay,
you need a full session anyway,
yeah,
so that the next person can actually just come and see it. So let's do that. All right.
awesome.
Take two. All right. So nobody has any questions. Great. Hopefully I'm doing my job and I'm seeing movement there, so that's good. So the amygdala hijack, coming back to that slide, again, it's the ability, you're skipping those processes. Our bodies are amazing things, however they were put together, whatever, the explanation is in your universe. It's an amazing creation because this is something that you're not thinking of, but your body does for you. This is so that you could get away from that saber-toothed tiger while we were being chased. Whatever your thoughts really are, that's what exists. This is a survival instinct. This is similar to being in denial. Then being in denial is the unconscious version of protecting yourself. If you're in at war, that's unfortunately a big topic right now. But if you're in the front line and you're in it, you don't have time to process your emotions. You have time to survive. So our bodies do more than one thing. This is the physical, and then our bodies just focus on what the task is, and we keep moving forward because the alternative is potential death, right? In a lot of these situations when this is the topic of discussion. So that's both sides of this for you. And this happens to people with developmental disabilities. This happens to people with neurodiversity. The problem in theory is that people that are neurodiverse may not have the same ability to process and to understand this messaging like everybody else. So when we're talking about somebody that might be getting told by their principal, go through the window, that's the safer place, and that person thinks that their principal is an idiot because they're smarter than them and they know that, and they really are, but they're not following directions, not because they're oppositional, but because they truly believe that's not the right thing to do and they go out the other way. Now we have a problem, right? And a lot of places aren't thinking about that whole thing where somebody might say, no, I'm going out this way, or I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to follow those directions, or they don't do anything. Um, that's a real life possibility. And that's why having all of these diagnoses put together has some benefit, but it also can muddy the water for figuring out who needs this the fastest. Um, and when I say that, I mean like what helpers and who are we talking about? These are things that have to go through a first responder or, a helper's head in all these situations at the same time that they're gauging what the danger is for themselves. So, that's the real world aspect of disaster and the other side of emergency preparedness is being prepared for being safe as well. So survival instincts, it's to allow you to be aggressive if you need to be. It's an unconscious thing like riding a bike. and we talk about this, its role in all these different things that we see here, and they're different things like that. I can distinctly remember um, at the bottom here, I have two little examples. Concerns for the population when things are chaotic. That's like I said, that's why we drill all these different things. You know, the more prepared people are ahead for those drills, meaning when they know they're coming, they're less effective than when they don't know they're coming, right? So there is that part of it. Um, and there's the being observed aspect. When you know you're being watched, right? Like my this is my story actually. I worked at a store when I was a teenager called Natural Wonders. It was a geek store. I loved it. I worked there because I was going to get a discount on a telescope. That was my whole personal reason for being there. And I could not gift wrap for the life of me. Still can't. I'm still traumatized by it. I still won't touch gift wrapping. But I remember having to gift wrap something for somebody and having my manager at the time letting me fail. And not in a good way, not in a I'm mentoring you and this is something you need to do. In a like, let's embarrass you because I'm not happy with my job and I'm going to make you feel bad about it. Where they made me like sit there and there was a developing line. This is around like Christmas time. So, the line's getting bigger and bigger. And my observation, 30 years ago about this situation was that this person was staring at me and I could still feel her eyes on me as I was trying to do that. And no matter what was coming out of her mouth, I wasn't hearing it. She was telling me very concrete direction. Put the tape here, fold the line there. I wasn't hearing anything. All I was perceiving were all those other people's eyeballs staring right at me. And in reality, now that I'm like, an adult, the reality is they were probably giving her the death stares, not some 16-year-old kid that was trying to work, right? But my perception is baked into that, and that's forever. I don't like gift wrapping, right? There's a little psychology of Jason there for you. All right, so that's where that stuff really is comes from. It's really interesting stuff. And let me move into the next slide. So, give me 1 second. This little bar is in front of me. So, Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Act. So, again, whatever your perception, whatever about politics, these are things that have happened. So here's some information. This is an act that was passed requiring consideration of public health and medical needs for at-risk individuals in emergencies. This is a bipartisan thing. Nobody should be against this, right? There's really no reason to be upset with people looking out for people that are at risk. At risk is defined in the act by children, pregnant women, older adults, people with disabilities. That is extremely similar language to Medicaid and Medicare. If you were keeping track, that's almost exactly the same language. Probably by design, probably so that if there are emergencies, so let's take Philadelphia, for example. God forbid something really bad happens in Philadelphia, as what happened in New York in 9/11, a lot of people came to New Jersey for medical care. If you don't have your insurance with you or you don't have out-of-state benefits or for whatever reason, Medicaid has to get enacted for you on that behalf. So it's a whole thing. This is actually their way of trying to beat that get ahead of it, to make sure that this isn't going to be another issue for somebody dealing with stuff already on top of that. Okay. ADA Title II mandates that local governments and states provide communication that's clear for people with disabilities and for those without. It is really generic language, and the problem is that people with disabilities can mean a lot of things, right? It doesn't specifically mean cognitive disabilities, which would really be the most inclusive because that would mandate that those communications are legible and understandable by everybody. So generally speaking, there is no law, there is no standard. I think for public health, Sonia, it's somewhere in the 5th or 6th grade reading literacy level, and there's ways of like scanning documents and really seeing what is and what isn't the level. I like to go with a 3rd grade because it's still plausible. You can still get to that level. You can still have words. They're very basic. But a lot of times that's going to include, infographics because it's not just about literacy level. Again, there could be language issues, there could be learning disabilities, all of those things that we just saw, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, all of those things. all of those contribute to bigger pieces of the population. Um, and those bigger chunks, again, 1% of 1 million people is still a lot of people. ADA amendment in 2008, expanding the definition of what disability is to make it easier for AFN to be protected under our laws. So I wanted to throw that in there. And then another expansion is this. Another expansion is showing, sorry, the bar keeps going in the middle of this sharing thing. Can't move it. So, sorry, it will not move. Sorry, guys, give me 1 second. Let's see. And you guys can still see this, right? But I'm like not in it now. Yep. Okay. Thank you. I
Yep.
saw the thumbs up. All right. We're back and we're moving on. So when we're talking about AFN specifically, this is the ironed out items that we're talking about specifically when we're looking at this. So here you have it on the left side. These are the different people we're talking about. Again, very similar population to these guys over here. So that's a good one to think of when we're talking about all these things. So over here, it has this framework called CMIST. It has the framework spelled out for you, utilizing a framework of communication, maintaining health, independence, safety, support, and determination, and transportation. So we have this all around our inclusive communication planning, but we're also talking about some additional things like limited financial resources, chronic health needs, things of that nature. And again, the language and the literacy is part of that communication. Access to transportation is part of that. So these are things that have to be thought of when we're talking about those things. I thought this was also interesting to bring in above our CDC provided infographics that are of that educational or literacy level, I should say, that would be considered to be appropriate. And then under it, these are the questions that we use, I should say the Census Bureau uses to collect information on disabilities. And I'm not going to read them to you, but if you look at them, they are very specific and very purposefully not asking for a diagnosis. By doing this, we don't get good information about what kind of disability.
Jason, you there? It looks like Jason might be experiencing some technical difficulties, but in case he does not come back, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. If you do have any questions related to the presentation, please feel free to email us at mrc@phila.gov. We'll be able to answer any questions for you, and be sure to join us next week for the second part of the series. With that, thank you all so much for joining and have a great night. Hey there, Jason.
I am so sorry about that,
That
everybody.
is totally okay.
Yeah, I'm glad we came back so that I can finish for your recording. Sorry,
Yeah.
everybody. All right.
No worries.
Okay. Through this. Okay. Can you see anything yet?
Yes, I can see your presentation now.
Okay, perfect. All right.
Hmm.
So, here we go. Okay. So here's some more examples of the Census Bureau. This is what they're talking about and asking. And again, this is why the data is really bad for these things because do you have serious difficulty walking or climbing stairs? Like, let's be realistic here. They're not asking this question with qualifiers. Did you just have surgery? Did you just play a sports game? Like, some people will answer this information very concretely. They're not going to understand that they're trying to ascertain if somebody has a disability or not. And you have to wonder why. Again, it's questionable, and this isn't, again, any political party because this has been around for a very, very long time. The more that we talk about these things, the more that we get this stuff out there, the better off it'll be. These years over here are the minimum age that they'll ask. So these are all for 5-year-olds. Otherwise, it's for anybody. So they'll ask that at the minimum age of 5 years. Now, do you have difficulty dressing or bathing? If I asked each of you, what the appropriate level of a 5-year-old's activities of daily living are, meaning should they be able to brush their teeth or not? Should they be able to pick out their clothing? Do you think they'd be able to cross the street? All those like nuancy things when you're a parent of a younger kid, and you're like, is my kid doing what they're supposed to? Or are they not? Is this a problem? All those things. That's kind of where this is going, and you don't know. So there's really nothing to norm this on other than, calling your friend and saying, "Hey, did your kid do?" You don't know. So these questions, obviously you could say I'm not a fan. Um, Tips for people with access and functional needs and how to create a plan. Trying to wrap it up for you. Providing emergency contacts and a spare key so people can get in. That's a really big one. So, one of a bunch of, to be honest with you, the towns down in New Jersey, the shore towns, they get really empty in the winter. All of our nice friends from Philadelphia and New York go back to their homes for their respective jobs and whatnot. And a lot of these towns are left with very little people around. Um, so what they do is they actually give their keys to the police officers so they can check in on the homes over the winter in case there's any leaks, burglaries, any of those things. So this isn't something that's totally outlandish, like reaching out to police officers or whoever to let them know, like you might need, especially if you're somebody that may have an access issue or stairs or something. This is something that you should really be considering putting copies of documents and health information and laminating them for 30 cents at Staples. It's waterproof. Plan for the needs of pets and service animals. That pet's going with you. Any first responder is going to take that pet with them for the most part because otherwise you're going to hold them up by having an emotional issue while you're there with the animal. Take the animal and figure it out later. Stock some non-perishable food. When we're talking about people with sensory needs, beef jerky may not be the right selection for everybody. I have it because it'll last forever and I've put it in my own bag and I can forget about it for a few years and it'll still probably be okay. So think of those things now before you have to think about those things at the last minute. Depending on electrical powered medical equipment, receiving dialysis, limited mobility, you need to be active. People are not thinking of you for the most part, unless you have like a signed on the dotted line contract from somebody that they're coming for you. A lot of these, there's been some issues in some other states where there's a registry where you're told, yes, you will be evacuated. Someone's coming to get you. So the people wait and then nobody comes to get them and they should have evacuated. You could fill in the blanks with, the bad outcomes there. So a lot of this is preparedness, but yes, you can have a go bag that has certain things. They don't even like calling them go bags because this is something that's supposed to be sustainable. You're not going to just bring the quick open meals. You're going to be this is a bring the can opener kind of a situation, right? Meaning you're going to be doing this for a while. So you want to have that stuff, a blank whiteboard with a marker so that somebody with a communication issue can communicate. Having your phone is awesome because there's emojis and things like that. But remember, we live in a digital world. You have to think analogly. In other words, you got to have extra batteries if you're going to be relying on that. Print out some communication things and get them laminated. Get them into a, waterproof storage bag. You don't know what the situation's going to be. Last month when we had all that crazy winter stuff, we're used to it up here, right? I was talking to a colleague who's into the disaster scene, but in Louisiana, they really know disasters. And they were getting snow, like a lot of snow. And it was just like another New Orleans issue for them to figure out. So we don't know what could be coming and when it'll happen. Again, you have all these big events coming. We don't know. There could be a giant, heat wave during that time, or it could be thunderstorms, everything that happens, or even a blue sky. And that's what we train under, right? We want to train under blue skies so that when they're dark skies, we can be ready for that storm, so to speak. Speaking of not using metaphors. Um, so we invite people with abilities and disabilities to the discussion. The mantra is nothing about us without us. You should be talking to people with disabilities, with access issues, with those AFN needs before you speak to somebody like me. These are the folks that are going to be thinking about things that you're not going to think about. Height level differences because they're using a wheelchair, adaptive needs because, their left hand doesn't work or their thumb doesn't have sensation, things like that. Remember to speak to that individual directly, whether they can speak back to you or not. Give them that respect, give them the opportunity. Not everyone communicates the same. Again, like I've always said, if somebody just because they can't verbalize something doesn't mean they can't understand everything you're saying. Receptive and expressive are completely two different sides of that pizza pie, so to speak. Okay. And don't assume anyone's ability or need, just ask appropriately. It's okay to ask somebody generally if they need some assistance. Is there anything I can do for you? Sometimes just sitting next to a person and just saying, yeah, this sucks is enough to get somebody to just start talking. Empathy is, a way of walking in somebody else's shoes. Plan with empathy. Think about not only do I need these things to survive, of course, you need structure, you need food, you need access to clean air and all that, 100%. But if we're going to be doing something for a while, we need things to entertain our brains. We need things to make sure that we can maintain some routine, things like that. So think along the mental health side of things, too, because the last thing you want is somebody in a shelter having a mental health crisis that nobody can deal with. I think that's it. Yeah. Okay. So I'll stop here again, third time now, I think, for questions. See if anyone has any. If not, thank you very much for hanging out with me, the extra segment that we did tonight so that we could do the recording for the unit. So thank you. Any questions, comments, concerns, thoughts, Sonia?
I am not seeing anything in the chat, but thank you so much for hopping back on to finish that recording. As we always do, will be posted on our YouTube, so you can refer to that, and the slides have been posted in the chat. Yeah, thank you so much, Jason. This
Great.
was really great.
Thank you. Great to have everybody. And again, thank you all for sticking around. We appreciate it.